The September sun bathed Manhattan's skyline in golden light as Margaret Hartwell stood before the full-length mirror in her Upper East Side penthouse. She adjusted her pearl necklace, William's final gift before the stroke claimed him 12 years ago. The cool, lustrous beads felt heavy against her skin today, as if they too carried the weight of memories and expectations. At 65, her reflection showed a woman who had weathered loss with dignity, silver hair, elegantly swept up posture straight, despite the year's eyes that had seen enough to know better, but still hoped anyway. Tonight was Thomas's 40th birthday celebration, her only son, the last living connection to William. She turned away from the mirror, walking past the Monet painting that visitors assumed was a reproduction, but wasn't. The Hartwell name had weight in certain Manhattan circles, but few knew the true extent of their holdings. Margaret had made sure of that. The gift was waiting downstairs, a Range Rover autobiography in obsidian black, with custom interiors, a $300,000 machine that purred like satisfaction itself. She'd spent months working with the dealership to ensure everything was perfect, from the heated massage seats to the personalized plates. Thomas had always loved cars, even as a boy, his small hands running over magazine pages featuring exotic vehicles. The memory made her smile despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Perhaps this gift would bridge something between them. The distance that had grown like ivy over a neglected garden wall, slow at first, then seemingly overnight covering everything. When had her son become a stranger? Was it when he'd married Jessica 12 years ago? Or during his college years, when the humble boy she'd raised gradually transformed into someone who measured worth by price tags? The changes had been subtle until they weren't. The chauffeur waited with the Bentley. As Manhattan's concrete canyons gave way to the tree-lined elegance of the route to the Hamptons, Margaret found herself drifting through memories. William's booming laugh, Thomas's high school graduation, the early days of Hartwell Enterprises when she'd been more than William's wife. She'd been his partner, though few credited her business acumen. After William died, those same business associates had expected her to sell her controlling interest. Instead, she'd doubled the company's value within a decade. The Tribeca development project alone had netted $40 million. The Chicago expansion had added another $65 million. The Miami beachfront properties were now valued at $80 million. But she'd kept these victories quiet, sharing them only with Richard Palmer, her trusted attorney and friend of 40 years. Thomas remained unaware of how dramatically the family fortune had grown under his mother's stewardship. She'd had her reasons for the secrecy. She'd seen too many heirs destroyed by the knowledge of their impending wealth. Better to let Thomas make his own way, establish himself on merit rather than inheritance. At least that had been the theory. In practice, it had backfired spectacularly. The Hamptons mansion loomed ahead, 6 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, tennis court, infinity pool, and ocean views that featured in architectural magazines. Thomas had purchased it 3 years ago with the small trust fund she'd released on his 37th birthday. Small being relative, it was $3 million, a test of sorts. One he'd failed by immediately leveraging it into this monument to excess. Valets in crisp uniforms took her car. Caterers bustled about with silver trays. The air smelled of money, that particular blend of expensive cologne premium liquor, and the indefinable scent of people who've never worried about paying bills. Margaret recognized some faces from Manhattan society, others from Thomas's business circles. Junior executives laughed too loudly at his jokes. Women with surgical enhancements air-kissed her cheeks without meeting her eyes. Jessica appeared resplendent in a designer gown that probably cost more than what most people earned in 3 months. At 32, Thomas's wife remained strikingly beautiful blonde hair cascading over tanned shoulders, diamonds glinting at her ears, throat, and wrists. "Welcome, Margaret. We're so glad you could make it." Jessica's words were warm. Her eyes were not. The house was filled with elaborate floral arrangements, ice sculptures, and a string quartet playing in the corner. Margaret searched for her grandchildren among the crowd. 9-year-old Olivia and 7-year-old Ethan were nowhere to be seen. Probably upstairs with the nanny. Again. When had she last spent real time with them? Easter, perhaps. No Christmas. Jessica had orchestrated a carefully controlled 2-hour visit before they were whisked away to another engagement. The time before that had been Ethan's piano recital, where Margaret had been seated in the back row despite arriving early. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. The seating arrangement for dinner confirmed what Margaret already knew. She was placed at a peripheral table with Thomas's former college roommate's parents and an elderly couple she didn't recognize. Not at the main table where family should be. Not near her son on his milestone birthday. "I'm sorry, there must be a mistake." Margaret addressed the young hostess with the seating chart. "No mistake, Mrs. Hartwell. These are the arrangements Mrs. Thomas approved personally." Margaret swallowed her dignity along with her protest. She'd learned long ago when to fight and when to observe. Tonight was for observation. Dinner passed in a blur of overpriced cuisine and superficial conversation. Her table mates were kind enough, but clearly wondering why Thomas's mother sat with them rather than at the place of honor. She offered vague explanations about wanting to meet new people. The elderly gentleman, a retired surgeon, saw through the polite fiction, but was gracious enough to engage her in genuine conversation about his medical humanitarian work in developing countries. After dessert came the toasts and presents. Business associates presented Thomas with luxury watches, rare whiskeys, and custom golf clubs. Jessica gave him a first edition Hemingway that Margaret knew he would never read. Then the moment arrived. "I'd like to present my gift now." Margaret's voice carried across the room as she stood. Conversations quieted. Thomas looked up from his champagne, surprise evident on his face. Perhaps he'd forgotten she would bring anything beyond her presence. The dealership had arranged for the SUV to be parked prominently outside. A red bow adorned the hood, catching the outdoor lighting installed specifically for the occasion. Margaret handed Thomas the key fob custom-made with his initials in gold. For a brief moment, she saw a flash of the boy he'd once been, eyes widening with genuine surprise and pleasure. That expression alone was worth every penny of the $300,000 price tag. Then Jessica whispered something in his ear, and his face changed. The mask of the confident, slightly bored wealth manager slid back into place. Thomas raised his champagne glass. His voice projected for the entire gathering to hear cheers to the mom who thinks you can buy love. Laughter rippled through the crowd like a sudden squall across calm waters. Jessica's laugh was the loudest, her head thrown back to display her perfect throat. Some guests had the decency to look embarrassed, but most joined in the merriment. Margaret became the punchline, the pathetic older woman trying too hard to impress her successful son. She didn't flinch, didn't allow her expression to change. Silence is not absence. Silence is choice. Silence is strength dressed in satin. William had taught her that during their early years when business rivals had underestimated them. She'd perfected the art through decades of boardroom negotiations where men assumed she was merely decorative until she systematically dismantled their proposals. Margaret simply smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of lips that revealed nothing of her inner turmoil. She raised her own glass in acknowledgement, took a deliberate sip, and returned to her seat with unhurried grace. She observed Thomas throughout the remainder of the evening, how he barely glanced her way after the public humiliation, how he leaned into Jessica's whispers, both of them occasionally looking toward Margaret before chuckling, how he preened under the attention of younger colleagues who clearly wanted something from him. When the party moved to the expansive patio for cocktails and dancing, Margaret slipped away. No one noticed her departure. She retrieved her wrap from the coat check and called for her car service, declining the valet's offer to contact Thomas or Jessica to say goodbye. The return journey to Manhattan was a quiet tunnel of reflection. City lights blurred through tears she finally permitted herself to shed. Not for the public slight she'd weathered worse in boardrooms around the world. No, she wept for the death of a hope she hadn't realized she still harbored, that somewhere inside the man Thomas had become remained the thoughtful boy who'd once made her a clay handprint for Mother's Day and insisted on sleeping in a chair beside her bed when she had pneumonia. That child was gone, replaced by someone who saw her as nothing more than an obligation, or worse, an ATM with a heartbeat. How had she failed so completely as a mother? Was it the money, the privilege, or something fundamental in how she'd raised him after William's death? The penthouse felt cavernous when she returned. Margaret slipped off her heels and poured herself 2 fingers of William's favorite Macallan. She hadn't expected the evening to end well, but reality had managed to sink below even her tempered expectations. Perhaps she'd been wrong to shield Thomas from the full extent of the family wealth. Perhaps knowledge of his inheritance might have made him more responsible rather than less. Or perhaps he would have squandered everything even faster. She would never know now. Margaret walked to the antique desk where she kept important family documents. The original copy of her will lay inside the locked drawer. Current provisions left the bulk of her estate to Thomas, with smaller portions set aside for her grandchildren's education. The document suddenly felt wrong in her hands, like clothing that no longer fit. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she watched the Manhattan skyline transition from darkness to the gray limbo before dawn finally erupting into the full glory of sunrise. As light flooded her living room, illuminating the collection of art she and William had carefully curated over decades, clarity came with it. Better to leave as myself than stay as someone else's afterthought. The words formed in her mind with surprising certainty. She'd spent 12 years trying to maintain the motherly connection with Thomas that Jessica seemed determined to sever. 12 years of increasingly expensive gifts that barely warranted thank you calls. 12 years of rearranging her schedule whenever Thomas could fit her in, only to have those appointments frequently canceled or cut short. The realization settled over her with unexpected lightness. She'd been holding on to something that no longer existed. The time had come to let go. When morning properly arrived, Margaret made 2 calls. The first was to Richard Palmer requesting an urgent meeting regarding her will and estate planning. The second was to her financial advisor, instructing him to prepare detailed analyses of all Hartwell holdings and potential liquidation strategies. Richard arrived at her penthouse promptly at 10, his lined face grave as she explained her intentions. "Before you tell me I'm overreacting to one thoughtless comment, there's something you should know." Margaret opened her laptop, showing Richard an email Thomas had sent her 3 weeks before his birthday. In it, he requested a loan of $200,000 for temporary cash flow issues at his firm. The tone was perfunctory, almost demanding, with no inquiry about her well-being or life. "This is the 3rd such loan request this year, Richard. None have been repaid. None have been accompanied by so much as a coffee invitation. But I need to tell you something else that happened before I make any decisions." Richard's expression darkened further as she related the seating arrangement, the public mockery, the whispered jokes at her expense. He'd known the Hartwells for over 4 decades, had watched Thomas grow from a toddler to a man. "There's actually one more thing you should know, Margaret." Richard hesitated, professional ethics clearly warring with personal loyalty. "Thomas contacted me last week. He was inquiring about your estate planning, specifically whether there were any provisions for him to assume control of your assets if you were deemed incapable of managing them yourself." The betrayal landed like a physical blow. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she poured more tea. "He mentioned that he's concerned about your spending habits, that he fears you're being taken advantage of by unscrupulous financial advisors. He suggested having you evaluated for cognitive decline." A bitter laugh escaped her. Cognitive decline. How convenient that would be for him. At 65, Margaret's mind remained razor-sharp. Her investment strategies had outperformed market indices for 11 consecutive quarters. Just last month, she'd negotiated a complex international real estate deal in fluent Mandarin, surprising the Chinese investors who'd expected to take advantage of an elderly American woman. Did Thomas know that his mother had quietly amassed a personal fortune that dwarfed the trust fund he considered his birthright? That while he struggled to maintain a 6% return on investments, she consistently achieved 11%. That the modest penthouse he occasionally deigned to visit was worth $25 million in today's market? No. Because she'd never told him. Because she'd wanted him to love her for being his mother, not for being his bank. "Richard and I need you to prepare new estate documents immediately." Margaret's voice was steady now, resolve hardening like concrete setting. "I want to establish a foundation, call it Second Chapter. Its mission will be supporting women over 60 who need to rebuild their lives. Women who've been discarded or taken for granted." She outlined her vision with increasing animation. The foundation would provide grants for education business startups, housing assistance and legal support for older women facing age discrimination or financial abuse from family members. And Thomas Richard asked carefully, "He'll receive the penthouse and 10% of my holdings in Hartwell Enterprises. The remaining 90% will be divided between the foundation and trust funds for Olivia and Ethan, which they can access at age 30. Not 18, not 21. 30, with provisions for education and health care before that, but nothing that can be controlled or accessed by their parents." Richard nodded slowly, making notes. "And when do you want to inform Thomas of these changes?" Margaret considered this question carefully. Never crossed her mind first. Let him discover the truth after she was gone. But that would be cowardice, wouldn't it? Avoiding the confrontation while denying herself the chance to see accountability dawn in his eyes. "Not yet. First, I have other arrangements to make." Those arrangements began the following day. Margaret met with the CEO of Hartwell Enterprises, discussing the potential sale of her controlling interest to their longtime strategic partner, Blackwood International. Initial projections valued her shares at approximately $115 million. The news sent ripples through the executive team who had grown accustomed to her hands-off approach to management. None of them contacted Thomas, assuming incorrectly that he was already aware of his mother's plans. Next came the real estate portfolio. The penthouse would remain for now, but her vacation properties, the ski chalet in Aspen, the beachfront cottage in Martha's Vineyard, the pied-à-terre in Paris would be sold. Each carried significant equity and memories that no longer served her. Margaret approached these tasks with the same methodical efficiency that had built her fortune. Spreadsheets tracked projected revenues. Timeline charts mapped liquidation strategies. By week's end, the framework for her financial transformation was complete. What she hadn't anticipated was how liberating it would feel. Each decision removed another weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The obligation to maintain multiple residences she rarely visited. The responsibility of overseeing investments she no longer found fulfilling. The constant futile hope that Thomas would suddenly recognize her value beyond what she could provide materially. 2 weeks after Thomas's birthday debacle, Margaret received her first text from him since that night need to discuss year-end tax planning. Dinner next Thursday at Le Bernardin. My assistant will send details. No inquiry about how she was doing. No acknowledgement of his behavior. Not even the pretense of filial concern. Just a financial agenda disguised as a dinner invitation. She declined politely, citing a previous engagement. Thomas didn't respond for 3 days. When he did, his message revealed more than he likely intended. Fine, but we really need to review your portfolio before you make any major decisions. Jessica and I are concerned about your financial security. Margaret didn't dignify this with a response. Instead, she accelerated her plans. The sale of her 65% stake in Hartwell Enterprises proceeded faster than anticipated. Blackwood International, sensing an opportunity to acquire a long-coveted competitor, presented an offer that exceeded initial valuations by 15%. The resulting windfall, $132 million after taxes, was promptly directed into the newly established Second Chapter Foundation, with Margaret as chairwoman and Richard as legal counsel. With the major financial restructuring underway, Margaret turned her attention to the penthouse. For 23 years it had been her home. William had carried her across the threshold after they purchased it, both of them giddy with the extravagance. They'd raised Thomas within these walls, celebrated milestones, weathered crises. After William's death, she'd redecorated slowly, room by room, transforming the space from theirs to hers. Now she wandered through rooms filled with memories, deciding what to keep and what to release. The Monet would go to the Metropolitan Museum as a permanent loan in William's name. The antique desk where she'd signed countless contracts would move with her. The crystal collection that Jessica had repeatedly hinted should be kept in the family would be sold at auction proceeds directed to the foundation. Margaret engaged a real estate agent specializing in luxury properties. The penthouse hit the market with minimal fanfare, but maximum strategic exposure to qualified buyers. Within days, 3 serious offers emerged. She accepted one from a young tech entrepreneur and his wife, a couple who reminded her of herself and William decades earlier. They were self-made, unpretentious, despite their success, and genuinely appreciative of the penthouse's understated elegance. Meanwhile, she purchased a new home, a gracious waterfront property in a quiet Connecticut coastal town. 4 bedrooms instead of 6. A manageable garden rather than the terrace that required professional landscaping. Proximity to a vibrant community of artists, academics, and retirees who valued substance over status. The price, $3.2 million, was modest by her standards, but represented extraordinary privilege by any reasonable measure. Margaret recognized this, directing an equal amount to the Foundation's Housing Assistance Program as a personal matching grant. Through all these changes, Thomas remained oblivious. His occasional texts became increasingly insistent, each transparently aimed at ascertaining her financial activities without directly asking. Margaret maintained polite distance, offering vague reassurances while finalizing her transformation. She began exploring new interests. A watercolor class at the local arts center. Ballroom dancing lessons that awakened muscles long dormant. Volunteer work at the regional museum where her art knowledge proved unexpectedly valuable. Each activity connected her with people who knew nothing of Hartwell Enterprises or Manhattan real estate portfolios. People who saw her simply as Margaret, thoughtful, articulate, occasionally funny, always elegantly composed. Among them was a group that called themselves the Silver Linings, 8 women over 60 who met weekly for brunch and brutally honest conversations about aging relationships and reinvention. They welcomed Margaret without fanfare, treating her neither with the deference her wealth usually commanded, nor with the dismissal her age often prompted in younger circles. Catherine, a retired federal judge with a wicked sense of humor. Elaine, who'd started a successful organic bakery after her husband's death. Patricia, a former marketing executive now teaching business ethics at Yale. Dorothy, a pediatrician still practicing part-time while mentoring medical students. Janet, who'd left a 40-year marriage at 62 and now traveled the world photographing indigenous cultures. Helena, Sophia, Elizabeth, each with her own story of resilience and reinvention. These women expected nothing from Margaret except authenticity. Their friendship offered something her wealth couldn't buy: perspective without agenda support, without obligation, laughter without calculation. For the first time in decades, Margaret found herself part of a circle where her name carried no particular weight. The freedom was intoxicating. The penthouse sold quickly, closing scheduled for the end of September. Margaret arranged for her belongings to be moved to Connecticut, donating furniture and housewares she no longer needed to a program supporting women transitioning from shelters to permanent housing. The symmetry felt right, her excess becoming someone else's essential new beginning. 2 days before the scheduled closing, Thomas finally managed to corner her. His calls had become increasingly frequent as rumors of organizational changes at Hartwell Enterprises reached him. Margaret had deliberately maintained radio silence, allowing him to stew in uncertainty. Now he appeared unannounced at the penthouse, finding her supervising the final packing. Moving boxes filled the once immaculate living room. Spaces where priceless art had hung showed faint outlines on the walls. The crystal chandelier that had illuminated countless dinner parties was carefully crated for transport. Thomas stood amidst the dismantling of his childhood home, confusion giving way to alarm. "What's happening here? Are you downsizing? Why didn't you tell me?" His rapid-fire questions contained no concern for her well-being, only panic at the implications for himself. Margaret regarded her son calmly, noting how his designer suit couldn't quite disguise the tension in his shoulders. How his carefully maintained appearance, the $200 haircut, the Rolex watch, the manicured nails represented the facade he presented to the world. A facade that required constant financial maintenance. "I've sold the penthouse. I'm moving to Connecticut tomorrow." Sold it without consulting me. His indignation would have been comical if it weren't so revealing. What about my inheritance? What about family legacy? There it was, the naked self-interest barely concealed beneath a veneer of family sentiment. No question about where she would live or why she'd made this decision. Only concern for what he stood to lose. Margaret maintained her composure, though her heart ached with a pain that surprised her. Even now, part of her had hoped for better from him. The new owners are a lovely couple. They particularly appreciated the terrace garden. "You remember how your father loved working out there on weekend mornings?" Thomas wasn't interested in reminiscence. "Where are you moving? What's the financial strategy here?" His gaze darted around the half-empty apartment, cataloging missing valuables. The Monet, the crystal collection, the antique Persian rugs. Margaret allowed herself a small, sad smile. "I'm 65 years old, Thomas. I've decided to simplify my life and focus on things that truly matter. Is this about the birthday party? Because if you're still upset about that..." His tone suggested she was being unreasonable, holding a childish grudge over a harmless joke. Margaret didn't take the bait. "This is about choices. Mine, some of which are long overdue." Her calm only agitated him further. "Look, I know I should call more often, visit more, bring the kids. Jessica and I have just been so busy with..." She held up one hand, stopping his insincere excuses. "Save your performance, Thomas. I've had time to reflect these past weeks. I've come to understand that I've been complicit in our dysfunctional relationship by continuing to hope for something that doesn't exist." He bristled at the word dysfunctional, but calculation quickly replaced offense in his expression. "Whatever's bothering you, we can fix it. Family is everything." His rehearsed sincerity might have worked on someone who hadn't witnessed his evolution from earnest child to manipulative adult. "Indeed," Margaret's voice was soft but firm, "which is why I've established trust funds for Olivia and Ethan. They'll receive quality education, health care, and support for their talents. The principal amounts will become available to them at age 30, contingent on their completion of undergraduate education and demonstration of financial responsibility. Thomas's eyes narrowed. That's thoughtful. But why not discuss this with me first? I am their father. Yes, you are, and I'm your mother. Yet you didn't discuss investigating my cognitive capacity with me before approaching Richard, did you? Color drained from Thomas's face. Richard was violating attorney-client no. Richard was honoring his ethical obligation to his actual client. Me, not you. The betrayal still stung, but Margaret wouldn't give Thomas the satisfaction of seeing her pain. You were planning to declare me incompetent so you could control my assets. Your own mother. Thomas recovered quickly, pivoting to denial. That's absurd. I was concerned about your well-being. There have been cases of elderly people being manipulated by stop. Just stop. Margaret's voice remained level, but something in her tone silenced him immediately. I built Hartwell Enterprises with your father. After his death, I quadrupled its value while you were busy charging luxury vacations to company accounts. I've consistently outperformed market indices for over a decade, while you've struggled to maintain minimum viable returns for your clients. Thomas stared at her, recalibrating his understanding of the woman before him, no longer just his mother, but a formidable opponent he'd severely underestimated. I've sold my controlling interest in Hartwell Enterprises. The transaction closed last week. The proceeds, along with those from the penthouse and vacation properties, have been directed to the Second Chapter Foundation, which will support women over 60 rebuilding their lives after dismissal or betrayal by those who should have valued them most. Thomas's face contorted with shock calculations visibly running behind his eyes as he processed the financial implications. The fortune he'd assumed would eventually be his was evaporating before him. You can't do this. His voice wavered between threat and plea. I already have. Margaret's tone remained conversational, as if discussing nothing more consequential than a change in dinner reservations. You'll receive this penthouse, which you've now sold, and 10% of my former holdings in Hartwell Enterprises. Approximately $12 million in total. Considerable wealth by any reasonable standard, though perhaps disappointing to someone who expected significantly more. Thomas paced the half-empty living room, running hands through his perfectly styled hair. This is crazy. We need to talk to someone, a mediator, a family therapist. You're clearly acting out of emotional distress. Margaret almost laughed at the transparency of his attempt to pathologize her independence. On the contrary, I'm making rational decisions after years of emotional compromise. The distress was continuing to hope for appreciation from a son who saw me as nothing but a future inheritance, an occasional ATM. That's not fair. Thomas's protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. Isn't it? When was the last time you called just to ask how I was doing? When was the last time you remembered my birthday without your assistant reminding you? When was the last time you defended me when Jessica made thinly veiled comments about my relevance or value? Each question landed like a precise blow, targeting vulnerabilities Thomas hadn't realized were exposed. He had no answers because there were none that wouldn't confirm her assessment. Margaret softened slightly, seeing not just the entitled man before her, but also the remnants of the boy she'd loved fiercely. I've enabled this dynamic between us, Thomas, by never requiring respect as a condition of my generosity, by hoping that eventually you'd see me, really see me without financial incentive. That failure is on me. So this is what punishment. His voice cracked with indignation. No, this is consequence. This is boundary. This is me finally valuing myself enough to stop accepting scraps of attention in exchange for financial support. She straightened her shoulders, pearl necklace catching the afternoon light. It's also opportunity for you to develop relationship with me based on something other than expectation of inheritance. Thomas' scoffed mask of civility slipping entirely. Right, relationship. After you've stolen my birthright and given it to strangers. Margaret regarded him steadily. I've redirected assets I earned to purposes I value. Your birthright, as you call it, was never an entitlement to my life's work. It was the opportunity to be raised with privilege, education, and advantage that you've consistently taken for granted. Her words hung in the air between them, irrefutable truth that Thomas couldn't dispute without revealing even more of his callous entitlement. For a moment, Margaret glimpsed uncertainty in his eyes, a flicker of recognition that perhaps he'd miscalculated badly. Then his expression hardened again, self-preservation overtaking any potential for insight. You'll regret this. His voice was cold now, calculating. When you're alone in Connecticut with no family around, when you're too old to manage on your own and need care, when you realize that your so-called friends only value your charity dollars. Margaret felt an odd sense of peace despite his ugly implications. That's the fundamental difference between us, Thomas. I'd rather be alone with my self-respect than surrounded by people who see me as nothing but a resource to exploit. She moved toward the door, signaling the end of their conversation. I'll always be your mother. That door remains open should you ever want a relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial expectation. Thomas stared at her, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face: anger, confusion, calculation, and something that might have been regret if given space to develop. Instead, he straightened, his custom suit jacket facade of control reasserting itself. This isn't over. He brushed past her toward the elevator, unable to resist a parting shot. Margaret watched him go, feeling strangely light despite the confrontation. You're right about that, at least. This isn't an ending. It's a beginning. The elevator doors closed on her son's thunderous expression. Margaret returned to the half-packed living room, running her fingers along the edge of William's favorite reading chair, one of the few pieces she was taking to Connecticut. She wasn't naive enough to believe Thomas would simply accept her decisions. There would be legal challenges, perhaps. Certainly social repercussions as he shared his version of events with their mutual acquaintances. But for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly aligned with her own values. The path ahead might be uncertain, but it was unquestionably hers to determine. The realization brought with it not sadness, but a surprising sense of anticipation. At 65, she was starting a new chapter, one written on her own terms. 6 months transformed Margaret's world entirely. Spring sunshine warmed the back garden of her Connecticut home as she tended to newly planted hydrangeas. The salt breeze carried hints of the ocean just 2 blocks away, so different from Manhattan's perpetual symphony of horns and human bustle. Her hands, once manicured for boardroom appearances, now bore small calluses from gardening tools and pottery classes. She found these marks strangely satisfying, physical evidence of a life being lived rather than merely managed. The transition hadn't been seamless. Decades of city living had trained her to expect convenience at every turn. The slower pace of small-town life initially felt disorienting, like stepping off an escalator onto solid ground. But gradually, Margaret discovered rhythms that suited her. Morning walks along the shore, afternoon watercolor sessions where her initial frustrations gave way to modest skill, evening gatherings with the Silver Linings women who had become her unlikely anchors in this new reality. Margaret's Connecticut home possessed none of the penthouse's opulence, but offered compensations the Manhattan property never could. Sunlight flooding the kitchen each morning, garden space where hummingbirds darted between flowering bushes, a porch swing where she often sat with a book and glass of wine watching sailboats drift across the horizon. The house felt like her in a way the penthouse, with its museum-quality perfection, never quite had. Today marked exactly 6 months since Thomas's birthday debacle. 6 months of reinvention, boundary setting, and unexpected liberation. The second chapter foundation was now fully operational, with 5 full-time staff working from modest offices in downtown New Haven. They had already distributed 18 grants to women rebuilding lives after divorce, widowhood, or family estrangement. Margaret served as chairwoman, but deliberately limited her involvement in day-to-day operations, trusting the experienced nonprofit professionals she'd hired. She hadn't heard directly from Thomas since their confrontation in the penthouse, though Richard kept her informed of legal inquiries made through Thomas's attorneys. Initially, they had explored challenging the asset transfers on grounds of undue influence or diminished capacity strategies that dissolved when faced with overwhelming evidence of Margaret's mental acuity and meticulous documentation of her decisions. So far, Thomas had refrained from outright litigation, perhaps recognizing the public relations disaster of suing his elderly mother for choosing charitable work over enriching her already privileged son. Instead, he had launched a whisper campaign within their social circles, portraying Margaret as mentally unstable, embittered, and manipulated by unscrupulous advisors. The phone rang, interrupting her gardening reverie. Margaret recognized Richard's number and felt a familiar tension in her shoulders. His calls rarely brought positive news these days. "Margaret, I think you should know what's happening. Thomas's company is in serious trouble." Richard's voice carried the weight of decades of friendship layered with professional concern. The West Side Development Project has stalled after environmental violations were discovered. 2 major investors have pulled out. There are rumors of leveraged positions that can't be covered if the Hartford deal falls through, which appears likely. The information landed with complicated impact. Despite everything, a mother's instinct to protect her child still flickered within her. Yet Margaret recognized how Thomas's current predicament perfectly illustrated the character flaws she'd enabled for too long, prioritizing appearance over substance, shortcuts over diligence, expedience over ethics. Is he asking for help? Her question hung in the silence between them. Not directly, not yet, but Jessica has been liquidating assets, jewelry, art pieces. They've let go of 3 household staff at the Hamptons property. The Range Rover you gave Thomas is listed for sale online. Margaret absorbed this information with a measured exhale. The irony wasn't lost on her, the vehicle meant as a gesture of love being sold to cover financial missteps. Yet something deeper than vindication stirred within her, a sadness for lessons Thomas had never learned about sustainable success versus superficial achievement. The conversation with Richard confirmed what Margaret had suspected would eventually happen. Thomas had built his business and lifestyle on the assumption of unlimited family resources to bail him out of difficulties. Without that safety net, the house of cards was collapsing with predictable speed. 3 more weeks passed with no direct contact. Margaret continued her new routines, volunteering at the local art museum, hosting Silver Linings brunches, attending lectures at the nearby university where her substantial donation had established a women's leadership program. Catherine, the retired federal judge, had become a particularly close friend, her no-nonsense perspective and dry humor providing balance when Margaret questioned her decisions regarding Thomas. "You didn't cause this situation." Catherine's voice carried the authoritative tone developed over decades on the bench. "You simply stopped preventing its natural consequences. There's a profound difference between those positions." On a cool April evening, as Margaret sorted through donation requests for the foundation, her phone lit up with a name she hadn't seen in months, Thomas. Her finger hovered over the screen, heart accelerating despite her resolve to maintain emotional boundaries. She answered with deliberate calm. Thomas launched immediately into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about reconnecting, missing her presence in his life, and regretting their estrangement. The words might have seemed genuine if not for their careful construction and strategic timing. Margaret listened silently, noting the absence of any specific acknowledgement of his behavior or genuine inquiry about her well-being. "It's wonderful to hear your voice." Margaret kept her tone neutral, neither encouraging nor dismissing his overture. "How are Olivia and Ethan?" His response that the children were fine but very busy carried telltale brevity that confirmed Margaret's suspicions. This wasn't a personal reconnection. It was financial reconnaissance. Thomas fumbled through more pleasantries before finally revealing his true purpose, a business opportunity requiring immediate capital investment. An exclusive deal only available to a select group. A time-sensitive chance to multiply returns that would benefit the entire family. "I need about $4 million to secure the position." Thomas's voice dropped to a confidential tone as if sharing privileged information rather than requesting a bailout. "This could restore everything, Mother. Set things right for all of us." Margaret noted his use of mother instead of his usual mom, another calculated choice to invoke formality and obligation. She recalled similar patterns throughout the years, Thomas calling with extravagant investment opportunities that always coincidentally required funds just beyond his own liquidity. Each presented as the key to permanent financial security, each ultimately absorbed into his lifestyle with little lasting impact. "Tell me about what's happening with your current business ventures." Margaret deliberately shifted the conversation, testing whether Thomas would volunteer information about his financial difficulties. He didn't. Instead, he offered vague assurances about temporary market adjustments and strategic repositioning, corporate euphemisms for serious problems. The omission confirmed everything Richard had reported, and more. Thomas wasn't seeking connection. He was seeking a financial lifeline while concealing the severity of his situation. "I'd like to discuss this in person." Margaret made her voice warm but non-committal. "Are you able to come to Connecticut this weekend?" His hesitation spoke volumes. Thomas clearly hadn't anticipated being asked to visit her new home, a space that represented her independence from his expectations. After awkward excuses about prior commitments, they settled on the following Wednesday. Margaret ended the call feeling a complex mixture of disappointment and resolve. The conversation had confirmed her worst suspicions while simultaneously reopening maternal wounds she'd thought were healing. The Connecticut house gleamed with spring sunshine when Thomas's German luxury sedan pulled into the driveway Wednesday afternoon. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as he emerged, surveying the property with barely concealed judgment. His designer suit looked absurdly formal against the casual coastal setting, a visual representation of how out of place he was in her new life. Margaret welcomed him with genuine warmth despite her reservations. For a fleeting moment as they embraced, she felt the ghost of the little boy who once ran to her with skinned knees and triumphant finger paintings. Then he stepped back, and the calculating man returned, eyes already scanning the living room, mentally appraising furnishings and art pieces with the precision of someone assessing potential collateral. "This is cozy." Thomas's forced smile didn't reach his eyes as he gestured vaguely around the living room. The space, though beautifully appointed with select pieces from the penthouse and new items chosen specifically for this home, was indeed modest compared to his Hamptons mansion or her former Manhattan residence. "I find it suits me perfectly." Margaret guided him to the sunroom overlooking the garden. Tea had been prepared along with small sandwiches and pastries from the local bakery owned by Elaine's daughter. Thomas accepted refreshments with distracted politeness, clearly impatient to discuss his financial proposition. Margaret allowed him to outline his supposed opportunity, a commercial development project in Austin that required immediate capital commitment. His presentation included impressively detailed projections and glossy renderings of modern buildings nestled among carefully preserved green spaces. Had she not known better, the pitch might have seemed compelling. When he finally paused, Margaret set down her teacup with deliberate care. "You haven't mentioned the West Side Project's environmental violations, or the Hartford deal collapsing, or the investors who've withdrawn support from your company." Thomas's expression shifted from confident salesman to cornered tactician in an instant. His shoulders stiffened as he calculated his response, abandoning the pretense of casual family reunion. "Those are temporary setbacks, market fluctuations, nothing that impacts the fundamental strength of my business model." His voice carried practiced reassurance that might convince uninformed investors, but couldn't survive Margaret's experienced scrutiny. "You're facing potential bankruptcy within 60 days unless you secure significant capital." Margaret kept her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather rather than her son's financial implosion. "Your line of credit is maxed out. The Hamptons property has a second mortgage. Jessica has been selling her jewelry collection piece by piece." Thomas's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Have you been spying on me?" Margaret shook her head slightly. "I haven't needed to. The financial world is smaller than you might imagine, especially at certain levels. People talk particularly when they're concerned about exposure to failing ventures." For a moment, raw vulnerability broke through Thomas's carefully maintained facade. Desperation flickered in his eyes, the look of someone watching their carefully constructed world disintegrate. Then his expression hardened again as he switched tactics. "Fine, things are challenging right now. That makes this Austin opportunity even more essential. A win there would stabilize everything else." The defensive edge in his voice betrayed the fiction even as he maintained it. Margaret studied her son, the son who had never learned that wealth required stewardship rather than consumption, who had absorbed William's ambition without his integrity, who had mistaken material acquisition for accomplishment and confused financial leverage with actual capability. "I've reviewed the Austin proposal documentation you emailed yesterday." Margaret nodded toward her laptop on the side table. "The environmental impact study is outdated. The traffic analysis doesn't account for recent development in adjacent areas. The profit projections assume a rental market that doesn't align with current economic indicators for that region." Thomas blinked, momentarily thrown by her detailed analysis. "Those are minor technical They're fundamental flaws that would be immediately identified by any competent investor. The kind that suggest either sloppy due diligence or deliberate misrepresentation. Neither explanation reflects well on your business judgment." The facade crumbled entirely then. Thomas stood abruptly pacing the sunroom with agitated steps. "What do you want from me? Some groveling admission that I've made mistakes? Fine, I've miscalculated some investments, trusted the wrong partners, expanded too quickly. But that's how business works. You take risks. Dad understood that." Margaret allowed his outburst to wash over her without reaction. When he finally stopped pacing, breathing heavily with emotions too complex to name, she responded with measured calm. "Your father understood that integrity and thorough analysis must precede risk. He never confused luxury consumption with business investment. He built relationships based on trust rather than leveraging family connections for short-term advantage. Thomas's jaw tightened at the implicit comparison. The familiar resentment flickered in his eyes, the burden of comparison to a father whose legacy had shaped his opportunities while simultaneously establishing standards he couldn't meet. So that's it. You'll let my company collapse. Let 30 employees lose their jobs. Let everything Dad and I built together just disappear because I made some mistakes. His voice cracked slightly genuine emotion breaking through the manipulation. Margaret felt the familiar pull, the maternal instinct to protect, to rescue, to smooth the path. For decades, she had responded to that pull without question. Today, she recognized it without surrendering to it. I'm willing to help, but not by simply writing a check that postpones inevitable consequences without addressing their causes. Margaret maintained eye contact, her voice gentle but unyielding. If you truly want to preserve what you've built, it will require fundamental changes in both business operations and personal choices. Thomas's expression shifted between hope and wariness. What kind of changes? Margaret outlined her conditions. She would invest $2 million in Thomas's company, less than half his request. The investment would be contingent on him stepping down as CEO while remaining on the board. A professional management team would be installed, selected by Margaret in consultation with industry experts. Thomas would work under their guidance for 2 years, learning sustainable business practices rather than crisis-driven reactions. Additionally, Thomas and Jessica would need to significantly downsize their lifestyle. The Hamptons property would be sold, replaced with a more modest home. Their household expenses would be restructured according to a financial plan developed with advisors chosen by Margaret. Both would participate in financial counseling and family therapy sessions. These requirements aren't punishment. Margaret softened her voice, seeing the struggle on Thomas's face. Their opportunity to build something sustainable rather than continuing a pattern of spectacular growth followed by spectacular collapse. Thomas stood by the window, silhouetted against afternoon light that highlighted the premature lines stress had carved around his eyes. At 40, he suddenly looked older, weighed down by consequences he'd spent decades avoiding through his mother's intervention. "You want to humiliate me?" His words came quietly with more hurt than accusation. "Make me admit failure publicly. Surrender control of my own company. Live under financial monitoring like some bankrupt celebrity." Margaret shook her head slowly. "I want you to learn what real success requires: discipline, accountability, sustainable practices. The same lessons your father tried to teach you before status and appearances became your priority." Thomas's shoulders slumped slightly, the confident posture of the successful businessman giving way to something more authentically vulnerable. A lengthy silence stretched between them as he wrestled with pride, necessity, and the dawning recognition that his options had narrowed to paths he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Before Thomas could respond, the doorbell rang. Margaret wasn't expecting visitors. She excused herself, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts and the panoramic view of a garden far more modest than those surrounding his Hamptons estate. Margaret opened the front door to find Jessica standing on her porch, designer sunglasses pushed back on her perfectly highlighted hair. Unlike Thomas, she had foregone business attire, instead wearing casual luxury that somehow made Margaret's tasteful home seem immediately provincial by comparison. "I thought I might find my husband here." Jessica's smile contained nothing resembling warmth as she stepped inside without waiting for invitation. Margaret maintained her composure despite the surprise intrusion. "Yes. Thomas and I were just discussing some business matters. Please join us in the sunroom." Jessica surveyed the home with the same dismissive assessment Thomas had shown, though her disapproval manifested as exaggerated politeness rather than awkward compliments. She followed Margaret to the sunroom, where Thomas's expression revealed his shock at his wife's unexpected arrival. "Darling, I was worried when your meeting ran so long." Jessica's honeyed tone contradicted the sharp warning in her eyes as she kissed Thomas's cheek. "I thought I should check that everything was all right." The tension in the sunroom thickened immediately. Thomas's face registered a complex mixture of emotions, embarrassment, resignation, and something like relief at no longer facing his mother alone. Jessica positioned herself beside him, a united front despite the fractures Margaret had glimpsed in their relationship through Richard's intelligence network. "So have you secured the investment for Austin?" Jessica directed her question to Thomas, but kept her eyes fixed challengingly on Margaret. "We were discussing a potential arrangement." Thomas's voice had regained some composure, though Margaret noted how he shifted almost imperceptibly away from his wife's proprietary hand on his shoulder. Margaret, ever the consummate hostess despite the circumstances, offered Jessica tea. The younger woman declined with barely disguised impatience. The three sat in a triangle of competing interests, Thomas caught between his wife's expectations and his mother's conditions. Thomas was explaining the terms under which I might consider investing in the company. Margaret maintained her calm, addressing Jessica directly. These include professional management changes and significant lifestyle adjustments. Jessica's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose incrementally. Professional management. You mean removing Thomas from his own company? Not removing. Repositioning, Margaret corrected gently, allowing him to learn from experienced executives while remaining on the board and maintaining equity stake. Jessica's laugh held no humor whatsoever. That's absurd. Thomas built that company from nothing. He doesn't need corporate babysitters selected by his mother. Margaret resisted the urge to point out that Thomas had built his company using seed capital she had provided with client connections facilitated through Hartwell Enterprises' relationships in office space, initially subsidized by family resources. Instead, she focused on the present reality. The company is 3 weeks from insolvency. 3 major clients have withdrawn projects. The West Side development faces potential EPA sanctions. These aren't matters of opinion, they're documented facts that any potential investor would consider decisive. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, caught between his wife's defiant denial and his mother's unflinching assessment. The afternoon sun illuminated the three of them with indifferent clarity, Margaret composed in her simple linen dress, Jessica radiating defensive hostility in designer casual wear, Thomas visibly diminished in his power suit that suddenly seemed like costume rather than armor. Jessica's expression hardened into something closer to her authentic self than the polished social mask she typically presented. I think we're done here. This isn't help, it's control disguised as assistance. She stood tugging Thomas's sleeve expectantly. Come on, we don't have to subject ourselves to this. Thomas hesitated, visibly torn. The lifeline Margaret offered, though wrapped in conditions he found humiliating, might be the only option that didn't end in complete financial ruin. Yet accepting meant defying Jessica and acknowledging failure in ways his pride had always refused. Jessica, please. Thomas's voice carried uncharacteristic weariness. We need to consider all options right now. Jessica's eyes widened with disbelief that quickly hardened into fury. All options, including letting your mother take over our lives, making us sell our home, treating us like irresponsible children. Our situation is more serious than I've explained. Thomas spoke quietly, unable to meet either woman's gaze. We have maybe 4 weeks before the banks call the loans. The Hartford investors are threatening litigation over prospectus claims. If we lose the Austin opportunity too... His voice trailed off, the unspoken conclusion hanging in the air between them. Jessica stared at her husband with dawning comprehension that quickly transformed into calculated assessment. Margaret observed the shift with sad recognition. Jessica was recalibrating her position based on financial realities rather than emotional connection. Why didn't you tell me things were this bad? Jessica's accusation held more concern for implications than for Thomas himself. I was handling it. Thomas's defensive response sounded hollow even to his own ears. The Austin deal was going to fix everything. Jessica turned to Margaret with newly tactical consideration. These conditions, they're negotiable. Presumably Margaret maintained her composure despite the transparent shift. The financial investment amount is negotiable. The requirements for professional management and lifestyle adjustment are not. The standoff continued for several tense moments. Jessica glancing between her husband and mother-in-law, recalculating options with almost visible mental arithmetic. Thomas slumped slightly, the burden of pretense becoming too heavy to maintain. Margaret waiting patiently, having learned through decades of negotiations that silence often accomplished what words could not. This is ridiculous. I need air. Jessica finally broke the impasse, storming out of the sunroom toward the front door. Thomas rose halfway, torn between following his wife and continuing the conversation with his mother. Margaret nodded slightly toward the door, releasing him from the immediate choice. Left alone in the sunroom, Margaret sighed deeply. The confrontation had unfolded much as she had anticipated, though Jessica's appearance added unforeseen complications. She heard muffled voices from the front yard, Jessica's sharp accusations, Thomas's quieter responses. Their marriage had always struck her as a business arrangement masked by social convention, Jessica providing status and connections, Thomas providing financial security and social position. With one component of that equation now in jeopardy, the foundation was showing predictable stress fractures. 20 minutes passed before Thomas returned alone. His expression had shifted from defensive pride to something approaching genuine vulnerability. He stood in the sunroom doorway, suit jacket, removed tie, loosened small concessions to authenticity that spoke volumes. "She's gone back to the hotel. We're staying in New Haven while we're here." Thomas ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, disrupting its artificial perfection. "She thinks your conditions are manipulative and controlling, that we should find other investors instead." "Do you have other investors interested?" Margaret kept her tone neutral, neither challenging nor solicitous. Thomas sank into the chair opposite her, the weight of reality finally overtaking the performance of success he'd maintained for so long. "No, we've approached everyone who might consider it. The industry knows we're in trouble. Jessica doesn't understand how these things work, how quickly reputation becomes everything when capital is scarce." A silence stretched between them, not comfortable but not entirely adversarial either. For perhaps the first time in decades, they were speaking with a measure of honesty rather than calculation or obligation. The afternoon light had softened into early evening gold that bathed the room in gentle illumination. Thomas looked around the sunroom with new awareness, noticing details he'd overlooked in his initial dismissive assessment. The watercolor paintings on the wall, Margaret's recent work, modestly framed. Photography books stacked beside a reading chair. Fresh flowers arranged simply in a ceramic vase she'd made herself. Evidence of a life being actively created rather than passively consumed. "You seem happy here." His observation carried genuine surprise, as if he'd expected to find his mother diminished by her more modest circumstances. "I am." Margaret allowed a small smile to warm her features. "I've found that simplifying externals often creates space for internal expansion." The penthouse was beautiful, but it was also a museum of expectations, both mine and others. Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing this perspective that contradicted everything his adult life had been structured around. He twisted his platinum wedding band absently, a nervous gesture Margaret hadn't seen since his college years. "Jessica will leave if I accept your terms, if we sell the Hamptons house, if I step down as CEO." His voice held resignation rather than accusation. Margaret considered her response carefully, balancing honesty with compassion. "If your marriage depends entirely on financial status and appearances, then perhaps that's something to consider before moving forward." Thomas flinched slightly but didn't disagree. Instead, he asked the question that revealed more vulnerability than he'd shown in years. "Why are you willing to help me at all? After everything I've done, after how I treated you at the birthday party, after the things I said in the penthouse." Margaret reached across the space between them, briefly touching his hand, a gesture she wouldn't have risked even an hour earlier. "Because beneath the person you've become is the person you could be. Because I share responsibility for the values you prioritized. Because I'm your mother, and that hasn't changed despite everything else that has." Tears welled in Thomas's eyes, the first genuine emotion he'd expressed without calculation or performance. He blinked them back quickly, decades of conditioning against vulnerability, reasserting control, but not before Margaret glimpsed the wounded child beneath the failing businessman's exterior. "I don't know if I can do what you're asking." His admission came quietly stripped of pretense. "I don't know if I can start over, learn to live differently, admit that everything I've built is collapsing because of my own decisions." Margaret recognized the crossroads they had reached. Thomas standing at the intersection of pride and necessary growth, genuinely uncertain which path to choose. Her terms offered salvation wrapped in humility, a combination his ego had spent a lifetime avoiding. Yet the alternatives had narrowed to variations of complete failure, professionally and personally. The greatest strength isn't in never falling. It's in rising after falls that seemed unsurvivable. Margaret kept her voice gentle but firm. "Your father understood that. He built Hartwell Enterprises after his first two ventures failed completely. He just never talked about those failures once success came." Thomas looked up sharply, genuine surprise registering on his features. Dad failed at businesses twice. This revelation contradicted the perfect legacy that had shadowed Thomas's entire life, the impossible standard against which he'd measured himself and invariably found wanting. Completely. Lost everything both times. Margaret nodded, sharing a piece of family history she'd kept private during Thomas's formative years, perhaps mistakenly. "William thought it would discourage you to know how close we came to bankruptcy before you were born. In retrospect, perhaps that knowledge might have been valuable rather than damaging." Thomas absorbed this revelation with visible recalibration of his understanding of both his father and his own perceived failures. The comparison that had always felt impossible suddenly shifted into something potentially instructive rather than merely intimidating. A complex silence filled the room as evening shadows lengthened across the garden outside. Thomas stood and walked to the window, hands in his pocket's shoulders, carrying the weight of decisions too consequential to make impulsively. I need time to think, to talk to Jessica again when she's calmer, to consider options realistically. His voice held more authentic thoughtfulness than Margaret had heard from him in years. Of course, Margaret respected his need for space while recognizing the precarious financial timeline they faced. My offer stands with all conditions intact, but substantial decisions will need to be made within the week if intervention is to be effective. Thomas nodded, gathering his jacket and tie, small symbols of the carefully constructed image he might soon need to abandon. At the doorway he paused, turning back with uncharacteristic hesitation. The children ask about you sometimes, especially Olivia. She keeps the watercolor set you gave her last Christmas on her desk, though Jessica tells her it's not proper art supplies. The mention of her grandchildren, so casual yet so pointed, pierced Margaret's careful composure. She had respected the boundaries Jessica had established regarding access to Olivia and Ethan, refusing to use them as leverage, even when Thomas and Jessica had deployed every other manipulation. That Thomas would mention them now in this context suggested either genuine reconnection or calculated emotional leverage. Perhaps both simultaneously. I think of them often. Margaret kept her response measured despite the surge of longing his words triggered. They're always welcome here. There's a children's art program at the museum where I volunteer Olivia might enjoy it. Thomas nodded without commitment, the possibility hanging between them like a fragile thread that might strengthen or snap with the decisions of coming days. He left without further discussion, the sound of his expensive car starting and pulling away marking the conclusion of a conversation that had shifted something fundamental between them, though neither could yet define exactly what or how significantly. Alone in her Connecticut home, as evening settled fully around her, Margaret felt strangely peaceful, despite the emotional turbulence of the afternoon. She had offered what she could, financial support wrapped in necessary conditions for genuine change. Whether Thomas could overcome pride and habit to accept those conditions remained uncertain. What felt different was her relationship to that uncertainty. For the first time, Margaret's well-being didn't depend on Thomas's choices. She had created a life with meaning beyond family obligation or wealth management. The second chapter foundation was helping women reclaim their lives after setbacks similar to her own. The Silver Linings friendships provided connection without agenda or history. Her modest home offered comfort without showcasing status. Whatever Thomas decided in coming days would affect him far more profoundly than it would affect her. This realization brought neither satisfaction nor sadness, but simply clarity, the natural consequence of boundaries finally established and maintained with loving firmness. The phone rang again as Margaret prepared a simple dinner for herself. Catherine's name appeared on the screen, their weekly dinner plans temporarily forgotten amid the afternoon's drama. Margaret smiled as she answered, grateful for friendships that expected nothing beyond authentic connection. Whatever tomorrow brought with Thomas tonight, she would share good wine and better conversation with someone who valued her presence rather than her resources. The path forward remained uncertain, but Margaret faced that uncertainty from a position of hard-won strength rather than anxious anticipation. She had offered her son the opportunity for genuine transformation. Whether he could recognize that gift beneath its challenging conditions would reveal more about the man he had become than any words possibly could. 3 months passed with no word from Thomas. Margaret monitored his situation through Richard's discreet business connections, witnessing the accelerating collapse from a compassionate distance. Hartwell Capital Partners, the firm Thomas had founded with such ambitious fanfare 8 years earlier, officially declared bankruptcy in late June. The Hamptons house was listed at a desperate discount. Financial publications ran small but devastating profiles, analyzing the company's downfall, citing aggressive leveraging strategies and unrealistic revenue projections as primary factors. Thomas's name became cautionary shorthand in certain Manhattan circles for the dangers of expansion without adequate foundation. Throughout this public unraveling, Margaret maintained her new rhythms. The Second Chapter Foundation awarded its first major institutional grants. Her watercolor skills progressed from awkward dabbling to respectable technique. The Connecticut garden flourished under her increasingly confident care. Life continued forward while Thomas's carefully constructed facade crumbled into rubble behind her. The call came on a Wednesday evening in July. Margaret was reviewing grant applications on her porch swing when the hospital's number flashed on her screen. The professional voice on the other end explained with practiced neutrality that Thomas had been admitted for exhaustion and dehydration. No, his condition wasn't life-threatening. Yes, they had already administered intravenous fluids. No, his wife wasn't currently present. Thomas had listed Margaret as his emergency contact. The irony didn't escape her notice. After months without communication, she remained his designated safety net. Old patterns resurfaced despite all that had transpired between them. Margaret gathered her purse and car keys without hesitation, maternal instinct overriding complicated history. The drive to Manhattan Presbyterian took 90 minutes through moderate evening traffic, giving her ample time to prepare mentally for whatever awaited. The hospital's fluorescent harshness assaulted Margaret's senses as she navigated sterile corridors. How many times had she walked similar hallways during William's final illness? The antiseptic smell, the muted conversations, the underlying current of vulnerability all triggered memories she'd worked hard to process, but never quite escaped. Thomas looked diminished against the white hospital linens. His designer stubble had grown past intentional style into genuine neglect. Dark circles shadowed eyes that had lost their characteristic calculation. Weight had fallen from his frame, leaving his hospital gown draped over shoulders that seemed suddenly bony rather than broad. At 40, he looked simultaneously older and younger, the successful businessman's confidence stripped away to reveal the uncertain child who had once hidden in her closet during thunderstorms. Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, absorbing the visual representation of everything Richard's reports had conveyed in clinical terms. Thomas had lost more than financial standing. He had lost the identity constructed so carefully over decades, the unflappable success the man who controlled circumstances rather than being controlled by them. He didn't immediately notice her presence, gaze fixed on the muted television mounted opposite his bed. When he finally turned, recognition triggered a complex cascade of emotions across his features: embarrassment, relief, resignation, and something approaching genuine vulnerability. The doctor says it's just exhaustion and dehydration. Thomas's voice emerged rougher than his usual polished tones, as if unused to honest communication. I hadn't been sleeping, or eating properly. The body eventually rebels against such neglect. Margaret crossed to the bedside chair, setting down her purse with deliberate movements that gave her time to find appropriate words. His explanation omitted crucial context that exhaustion almost certainly masked psychological collapse under financial ruin and personal failure. The hospital provided convenient medical terminology for what might otherwise be called a breakdown. What can I do to help? Margaret kept her questions simple, avoiding recrimination or detailed inquiry that might trigger defensive withdrawal. Thomas's eyes filled unexpectedly, tears spilling before he could marshal control. The sight shocked Margaret more than his physical deterioration. Her son had not cried in her presence since early adolescence. He had constructed his adult persona specifically to avoid displaying such vulnerability, especially to her. Everything's gone. His voice cracked around the admission. The company, the house. Jessica left last week, took the kids to her parents' place in Boston. Said she needed space to reassess priorities. Translation: she married a successful CEO, not a bankrupt failure. Wouldn't even let me say goodbye to Olivia and Ethan properly. Just gone. Each revelation landed with the weight of consequences long anticipated, yet still painful to witness. Margaret had foreseen this outcome from their first confrontation in the Connecticut house. Jessica's character had been transparent from the beginning, attracted to status and security rather than Thomas himself. When those assets disappeared, so did her commitment. Thomas wiped his eyes with hospital-issue tissues, embarrassment battling with relief at finally speaking truth aloud. For years, he had maintained elaborate fictions about his marriage, his business, his lifestyle fictions. Margaret had recognized but never challenged directly. Now reality had stripped those protective layers away, leaving him nowhere to hide. I didn't listen. Thomas's admission came quietly, gaze fixed on the IV in his arm, rather than meeting her eyes. You offered conditions that could have saved everything, and I was too proud to accept them. Too afraid of what Jessica would think. Too convinced I could fix everything myself until it was too late. Margaret reached across the hospital bed railing, taking his hand gently. Thin and cold, so different from the confident handshake he'd cultivated for business interactions. Her touch seemed to release something further in him, permission to acknowledge complete defeat rather than maintaining partial pretense. I'm living in a one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn now. Thomas continued his inventory of losses, each admission seemingly easier than the last, as if confession carried its own momentum. Most of my friends disappeared when the money did. Turns out country club memberships and vacation home access were the real attraction. My Rolex paid last month's rent. Funny how quickly priorities clarify when options narrow. Margaret listened without interruption, recognizing his need to articulate the full extent of his collapse. The narrative emerged without self-pity, just exhausted acknowledgement of consequences resulting from choices made over decades. When his account finally wound down, silence filled the hospital room, punctuated only by equipment beeps and distant corridor conversations. I don't know what happens next. Thomas's admission contained none of his usual strategic planning or confident projection, just raw uncertainty from a man who had never previously acknowledged not having answers. Margaret considered her response carefully, balancing honesty with compassion. The truth was that Thomas faced a complete rebuild professionally, financially, personally. At 40, he would essentially start over from worse than nothing, carrying debt and damaged reputation rather than youthful potential. Yet beneath the rubble lay opportunity few ever received the chance to reconstruct with wisdom rather than hubris. One step at a time. Margaret kept her voice gentle, but not pitying. First, you focus on physical recovery. Then we can discuss options for moving forward. Thomas nodded slightly, accepting simplification that would have seemed insulting months earlier. The doctor says they'll discharge me tomorrow morning. His words carried implied question. Where would he go? What would happen next? Margaret heard the unspoken need beneath his statement. I'll come get you. You can stay at my place while you recuperate. Connecticut air will do you good. Relief washed across Thomas's features, not the entitled expectation of previous years, but genuine gratitude for basic kindness. He closed his eyes briefly, physical and emotional exhaustion claiming priority over further conversation. Margaret remained beside him as he drifted into sleep, watching the troubled expressions that crossed his face, even in unconsciousness. The following morning brought discharge paperwork and prescriptions for sleep aids and anti-anxiety medication, pharmaceutical confirmation of stress levels that had triggered physical collapse. Thomas emerged from the hospital looking older than his year's designer clothes from the previous day hanging loosely on his frame. The drive to Connecticut passed mostly in silence, Thomas gazing out the passenger window as Manhattan's familiar skyline receded behind them. Margaret had prepared the guest room with careful consideration, comfortable but not luxurious welcoming without suggesting permanent arrangement. Thomas placed his small overnight bag on the bed, surveying the space with none of his previous condescension toward her modest home. Each small kindness, fresh towels, reading material on the nightstand, a carafe of water seemed to register with newfound appreciation. The initial days established cautious routine. Thomas slept for 14 hours that first night, then 12 the next, his body reclaiming deficit accumulated through months of stress and neglect. During waking hours, he moved like someone recovering from serious illness, tentative steps through unfamiliar emotional and physical landscape. He spent hours on the porch swing watching sailboats drift across the horizon without the restless impatience that had previously characterized his every interaction. Margaret maintained respectful distance, neither hovering nor withdrawing. She prepared simple, nutritious meals, suggested short walks along the shore when color gradually returned to his face, provided space for recovery without expectation or timeline. Their conversations remained light weather observations, local news, Margaret's gardening progress topics requiring no strategic calculation or performance. A week into this healing interlude, Thomas's phone rang during breakfast. He glanced at the screen, face tightening with apprehension before answering. Margaret discreetly moved to the porch, giving him privacy for what was clearly Jessica's first contact since his hospitalization. When Thomas joined her 30 minutes later, his expression confirmed the conversation's difficult nature. She's filing for divorce. No surprise there. Thomas's voice held resignation rather than shock. She's requesting full custody of the children, citing my unstable financial and emotional condition as justification. Her father's lawyers have prepared everything. All very civilized on paper, all very calculated in reality. Margaret absorbed this information without immediate comment. Jessica's actions aligned perfectly with her character, as demonstrated throughout the marriage. The timing, waiting until Thomas had experienced medical crisis before serving divorce papers, spoke volumes about priorities and tactics. "Do you want to fight the custody arrangement?" Margaret kept her question neutral, recognizing the complex factors involved. Thomas sank into the adjacent porch chair, conflict evident in his expression. "I want to see my children, be part of their lives, but I have no home to offer them right now. No financial stability. Nothing a family court would consider favorable compared to Jessica's parents' mansion and unlimited resources." The painful reality hung between them. Jessica held every conventional advantage in custody proceedings: stable housing, family support, financial security. Thomas's recent hospitalization provided additional ammunition against him, regardless of the temporary nature of his condition. His options appeared severely limited when viewed through traditional legal frameworks. There are other approaches to consider. Margaret chose her words carefully, mindful of her son's fragile state. Family courts increasingly recognize that children benefit from maintaining relationships with both parents, regardless of financial disparities. With proper legal representation and a demonstrated commitment to rebuilding stability, joint custody arrangements might be possible. Hope flickered briefly across Thomas's features before practicality extinguished it. "I can't afford proper legal representation right now. The type of lawyers who could match Jessica's team require retainers I can't possibly provide." Margaret nodded, acknowledging this reality without immediately offering financial solution. Thomas needed to navigate his new circumstances without defaulting to maternal rescue, a pattern that had contributed to his current situation. Yet complete abandonment during legitimate crisis would serve no constructive purpose either. "Let me think about possibilities." Margaret patted his hand lightly before standing. "In the meantime, focus on continuing your recovery. Building strength, physical and emotional, will serve whatever path forward emerges." That afternoon, Margaret contacted Richard to discuss legal options. Their conversation quickly established that while Thomas's situation presented significant challenges, strategic representation might secure reasonable visitation rights as an initial step. Richard recommended Patricia Denholt, a family law specialist known for navigating high-conflict divorces involving significant wealth disparities. More importantly, Patricia emphasized maintaining healthy parent-child relationships throughout contentious proceedings. Margaret arranged an initial consultation without informing Thomas, wanting concrete options before raising potentially false hopes. Patricia's assessment, after reviewing preliminary details, proved cautiously optimistic. With evidence of Thomas's improving health, steady housing, even temporary, and commitment to rebuilding financial stability, a graduated visitation schedule might be achievable despite Jessica's advantages. The question of payment remained. Margaret could easily cover Patricia's substantial retainer, but recognized that directly funding Thomas's legal representation risked reinforcing problematic patterns. After careful consideration, she structured an alternative. The Second Chapter Foundation would establish a specialized legal aid fund for parents facing custody challenges due to temporary financial setbacks. Thomas could apply as the program's first recipient, meeting the same criteria required of future applicants. When Margaret presented this option to Thomas the following evening, his reaction revealed continuing evolution. Rather than entitled acceptance or reflexive pride, he responded with thoughtful consideration. "I appreciate the structure you've created, the accountability built into the arrangement." His acknowledgement represented significant growth from previous interactions. "I'd like to review the application requirements before deciding." This response, measured respectful of boundaries, acknowledging agency rather than assuming entitlement, marked subtle but profound shift in their relationship dynamic. Margaret provided the application materials without pressure or expectation. Thomas spent several days reviewing requirements, preparing documentation, and considering implications before formally applying. The Foundation's independent review committee, carefully selected by Margaret months earlier for their professional integrity, evaluated his application according to established criteria, ultimately approving legal assistance. Patricia took Thomas's case with clear parameters established from the beginning. She would pursue reasonable visitation rights while building toward potential joint custody as Thomas established greater stability. The approach would emphasize children's well-being rather than attacking Jessica personally, regardless of provocations that might emerge during proceedings. With this essential support secured, Thomas gradually turned attention toward rebuilding other aspects of his collapsed life. Margaret connected him with Richard's nephew, Jason Palmer, who managed a boutique real estate investment firm specializing in modest commercial properties throughout New England. Jason needed experienced associates who understood property valuation and client relationship management skills Thomas possessed despite his company's failure. Thomas's interview with Jason revealed both humility and residual strength. He acknowledged past mistakes without self-flagellation, demonstrated market knowledge without overconfidence, and expressed willingness to start at associate level despite previously holding CEO title. Jason offered position with modest base salary plus performance incentives far below Thomas's previous compensation, but representing critical first step toward financial recovery. The initial custody hearing arrived in early September, just as Connecticut trees began showing hints of autumn color. Margaret accompanied Thomas to the courthouse, providing quiet support without attempting to direct or control proceedings. Jessica arrived flanked by her parents and 2 attorneys, her expression coolly composed as she acknowledged Thomas with minimal courtesy. Her parents, Boston banking aristocracy who had never fully approved of Thomas despite his Harvard pedigree, maintained stony silence throughout pre-hearing interactions. Patricia navigated proceedings with strategic precision, emphasizing Thomas's improving circumstances without overstating current stability. She presented his new employment temporary but appropriate housing with his mother, consistent medical follow-up confirming resolved exhaustion, and genuine commitment to maintaining relationships with his children. Rather than requesting immediate joint custody, she proposed graduated visitation schedule building toward shared arrangements as Thomas established independent housing. Jessica's legal team countered with emphasis on Thomas's psychological breakdown and financial collapse, questioning his capacity to provide appropriate environment for children accustomed to certain lifestyle. They presented Thomas's hospitalization as evidence of fundamental instability rather than temporary crisis response. Each claim contained selective truth twisted toward predetermined conclusion that children belonged exclusively with Jessica and her financially secure extended family. The judge, a thoughtful woman in her 60s who had presided over family court for 20 years, listened carefully to both presentations. Her questions revealed nuanced understanding of dynamics involved how financial reversals impacted parenting capacity, how children experienced parental absence regardless of causation, how extended families influenced custody arrangements both positively and negatively. Her interim ruling reflected this balanced perspective. Thomas would receive regular weekend visitation rights beginning immediately. These would occur initially at Margaret's Connecticut home until Thomas secured appropriate independent housing. Visitation would expand gradually, according to predetermined schedule contingent upon Thomas maintaining employment and continued evidence of stability. Jessica would retain primary physical custody, but was ordered to facilitate children's relationship with their father through regular communication between visitations. The decision represented meaningful victory within realistic constraints. Thomas would remain present in his children's lives while rebuilding foundation for potentially expanded arrangements in future. Jessica retained primary control, but with judicial oversight preventing complete parental alienation. Both parties received partial satisfaction without either claiming complete victory. Thomas's first visitation weekend arrived in late September. Margaret prepared her home meticulously, creating comfortable spaces for Olivia and Ethan without excessive indulgence. She purchased art supplies, remembering Olivia's interest in painting, and selected age-appropriate books for both children based on interests Thomas had mentioned. A careful balance, welcoming without overcompensating, comfortable without extravagance. Jessica arrived precisely on schedule Friday afternoon, luxury SUV purring into Margaret's driveway with Germanic precision. She remained behind the wheel while her assistant helped the children from the vehicle with their weekend bags. The deliberate distance delivering children without personally engaging their father or grandmother established tone for handoffs to come. Olivia exited the car first 9 years old, going on 30 in her carefully coordinated outfit and reserved expression. Her eyes assessed Margaret's home with the evaluative gaze she'd inherited from her mother, cataloging differences from the Hamptons mansion she'd previously known. Ethan followed with less composure, 7-year-old energy barely contained as he spotted Thomas waiting on the porch steps. Daddy Ethan broke protocol by running toward his father while the assistant was still reviewing weekend instructions with Margaret. The boy launched himself into Thomas's arms with unrestrained enthusiasm, innocent of adult complexities that had restructured his family landscape. Thomas caught him with visible emotion, holding slightly too tight before setting him down carefully. Olivia approached more cautiously, uncertain of appropriate behavior in this unfamiliar circumstance. Her formal hug conveyed conflicted loyalty, love for her father tempered by awareness of her mother's disapproval. Thomas knelt to her level, maintaining connection without demanding demonstration that might compromise her complicated position. Jessica departed without direct communication, a final dismissive glance, her only acknowledgement of the exchange. The assistant provided printed schedule of children's activities, dietary restrictions newly implemented since divorce proceedings began, and emergency contact information. The formality transformed normal parenting information into legal documentation, every interaction potentially scrutinized for future court proceedings. The initial hours carried awkward navigation as children acclimated to unfamiliar environment and restructured family configuration. Olivia maintained careful poise, answering questions politely while volunteering minimal information. Ethan alternated between exuberant engagement and sudden withdrawal, emotional pendulum swinging between joy at reconnection and anxiety about changed circumstances. Margaret maintained deliberate peripheral presence available without inserting herself supportive, without undermining Thomas's parental authority. She provided snacks when appropriate, suggested activities when conversation lagged, then retreated to allow father and children space to re-establish connections, strained by absence and transition. By Saturday morning, artificial formality had begun dissolving into more natural interactions. Breakfast conversation flowed more easily as children adjusted to new surroundings. Olivia cautiously revealed recent school achievements: piano recital selection, science project, recognition reading, competition finalist. Each disclosure emerged with careful monitoring of Thomas's response, as if testing whether his interest remained genuine despite family reconfiguration. "I practiced piano every day, Daddy, even when Mom said I could skip because we were busy." Olivia's revelation contained both pride in discipline and subtle indication of competing parental expectations. "I'm playing Beethoven's Für Elise for the fall concert. It's really hard, but Ms. Peterson says my technique is exemplary for my age group." Thomas's genuine enthusiasm for her accomplishment visibly relaxed something in Olivia's careful composure. The validation she sought hadn't disappeared with the Hamptons' house and family structure. Her father's appreciation existed independently from financial circumstances, a crucial discovery for a child navigating divorce aftershocks. Margaret suggested afternoon visit to the local art museum where children's program offered watercolor workshop that weekend. Olivia initially hesitated, glancing toward her weekend bag as if expecting appropriate attire might be missing for such activity. Thomas gently explained that the community museum welcomed visitors in casual clothes, emphasizing experience rather than appearance. The museum visit marked a turning point in the weekend dynamics. Olivia discovered unexpected freedom in less structured creative environment than her usual formal lessons. The instructor, a retired art teacher with infinite patience, encouraged experimentation rather than technical perfection. When Olivia revealed she had her grandmother's watercolor set at home, but rarely used it because Mom says proper art requires proper training, Margaret exchanged knowing glance with Thomas without direct comment. Ethan, meanwhile, discovered the museum's music room where visitors could experiment with various instruments. His natural affinity for rhythm emerged immediately, small hands finding complex patterns on djembe drums that drew appreciative attention from other visitors. Thomas watched his son's absorption with newfound awareness, recognizing talent previously overshadowed by Jessica's emphasis on structured activities and measurable achievements. That evening, Olivia asked Margaret about her own painting displayed in the guest bathroom, a simple seascape capturing Connecticut shoreline in early morning light. Nothing extraordinary by professional standards, but competently executed with genuine feeling. "Did you take lessons for a long time before you could paint like that?" Olivia's question revealed assumptions about skill acquisition instilled by her mother's perspective. Margaret considered her response carefully, recognizing opportunity to offer alternative viewpoint without directly contradicting Jessica's values. "I actually started painting just this year, at 65. The local arts center offers beginner classes for any age. I'm still learning basic techniques, but I've discovered that creating something brings joy regardless of technical perfection." This concept that creative expression held intrinsic value beyond external evaluation visibly intrigued Olivia. The possibility that enjoyment rather than achievement might justify artistic pursuit represented paradigm shift for a child raised with Jessica's performance-oriented standards. Sunday morning, Thomas took the children to nearby beach for shell collecting and exploration. Margaret remained home, providing space for uninterrupted parental bonding while preparing special lunch for their return. From the kitchen window, she watched their distant figures along shoreline, Thomas pointing out interesting findings, Ethan racing through shallow waves, Olivia gradually relaxing into less self-conscious movement and expression. When Jessica's assistant arrived precisely at scheduled departure time Sunday afternoon, both children showed reluctance to leave significant shift from their uncertain arrival. Olivia had completed 3 watercolor paintings she proudly displayed for her father's admiration. Ethan clutched small collection of special shells and stones discovered during beach exploration. Both children extracted promises about activities for next visitation before accepting the inevitable transition back to primary residence. The house felt unexpectedly empty after their departure. Thomas moved through rooms gathering scattered evidence of childish occupation. Abandoned socks, half-finished drawings, rearranged sofa cushions from impromptu fort construction. Each item received careful consideration before being either discarded or preserved for future visits. His methodical attention to these remnants revealed emotional significance beyond their physical presence. That was different than I expected. Thomas finally broke the contemplative silence as they restored living room to its previous order. Better in some ways, harder in others. Margaret nodded, understanding complexities contained within his simple assessment. The children had connected genuinely despite circumstances, yet each interaction carried awareness of limited time and competing loyalties. Joy in reconnection existed alongside pain of inevitable separation. Progress toward new relationship patterns accompanied grief for lost family structure. I saw them differently this weekend. Thomas continued folding a small blanket Ethan had carried throughout the visit. Without the constant activities and achievements Jessica always scheduled. Without the designer outfits and perfectly managed appearances. Just themselves. His observation contained no criticism of Jessica's parenting, merely recognition of different values and priorities that had always existed beneath their unified parental presentation. In the Hamptons, life children's development had focused primarily on measurable accomplishments and social positioning. Music lessons emphasized performance and competition rather than creative expression. Academic achievement received praise while imaginative play went largely unnoticed. Did you see how Ethan responds to rhythm? Margaret kept her tone conversational rather than judgmental. The way he naturally found patterns in those drums, and Olivia's eye for color composition, that's genuine talent beyond technical training. Thomas nodded, continuing his thoughtful assessment. Jessica always focused on structured activities with clear measurement standards. Piano competitions, academic rankings, sports with quantifiable outcomes. There's value in that discipline, but I saw something different this weekend. Something I was missing before. This recognition that his children possessed intrinsic qualities beyond achievement, metrics represented significant perspective shift. Thomas was seeing his children as individuals rather than extensions or representations of parental success. The insight came painfully late, but carried potential for relationship reconstruction based on genuine connection rather than performance evaluation. The following weeks established new patterns as Thomas gradually rebuilt foundation for independent life. His position with Jason Palmer's firm provided modest but stable income. Weekend visitations with children continued successfully, each interaction building toward more natural relationship despite artificial constraints. Margaret maintained supportive presence without assuming control, allowing Thomas to navigate consequences and opportunities through his own developing judgment. October brought unexpected communication from Jessica, the first direct contact since hospital discharge. Her carefully worded email requested meeting to discuss practical aspects of their separation beyond legal proceedings. Thomas approached this overture with cautious optimism, recognizing potential for either improved co-parenting communication or additional strategic maneuvering. The meeting occurred at neutral Manhattan restaurant, upscale enough for Jessica's standards, but not ostentatiously exclusive. Thomas arrived punctually in business attire that reflected his new circumstances' quality, but not luxury professional, without flashy signifiers of wealth. Jessica appeared precisely 5 minutes late, designer ensemble and perfect grooming presenting unchanged affluence despite family reconfiguration. Their conversation began with practiced civility, discussing children's academic progress and scheduled activities with minimal personal engagement. Jessica maintained professional courtesy while establishing subtle dominance through references to privileges and opportunities Thomas could no longer provide independently: private school connections, social introductions, extracurricular advantages facilitated through her family's position. Only after preliminary discussions did Jessica reveal her actual purpose. Her family's investment firm had acquired controlling interest in a distressed commercial property management company with significant potential for rehabilitation. They needed someone with specific industry knowledge to oversee operational restructuring, someone familiar with both luxury property expectations and practical management requirements. The position offered substantial compensation, including performance incentives and potential equity stake. Jessica presented this opportunity with careful neutrality, avoiding direct acknowledgement that she was essentially offering Thomas professional lifeline through her family's resources. The arrangement would provide him financial stability, professional rehabilitation, and capability to secure appropriate housing for expanded custody arrangements. The unstated exchange, Thomas would receive career resurrection while Jessica's family gained his valuable expertise without market rate compensation, given his vulnerable position. Thomas listened without immediate response, hearing multi-layered implications beneath surface proposition. The opportunity represented genuine chance for professional recovery, yet acceptance would place him under indirect control of former in-laws who had never fully respected him, even during successful periods. The improved financial circumstances would support expanded relationship with his children, yet that relationship would exist within framework established through Jessica's family influence. "I appreciate the consideration." Thomas finally responded with measured neutrality matching Jessica's presentation. "I'd need to review specific responsibilities, reporting structure, and performance metrics before making any decision." His response, professional rather than emotional, evaluative, rather than instantly grateful, clearly surprised Jessica, who had anticipated either eager acceptance or prideful rejection. This thoughtful middle path suggested evolution beyond patterns she had anticipated based on previous interactions. The meeting concluded with practical arrangements for upcoming children's events and agreement for Thomas to review detailed position documentation before further discussion. Jessica departed with slightly recalibrated assessment of her former husband, still requiring her family's assistance, but perhaps developing judgment previously absent from his decision-making approach. Thomas discussed the proposition with Margaret that evening, methodically analyzing advantages and potential complications from various perspectives. The opportunity offered clear benefits: accelerated financial recovery, professional re-engagement with significant potential improved housing options, supporting expanded custody. Yet accepting placed him within complex power dynamic where personal history complicated professional boundaries. What matters most is how this affects your relationship with Olivia and Ethan. Margaret offered perspective without specific recommendation. Financial stability creates foundation for expanded visitation, potentially leading to joint custody. The question becomes whether working within Jessica's family influence helps or hinders healthy parent-child relationships longer term. Thomas nodded, continuing careful consideration rather than rushing toward decision. The thoughtful evaluation itself demonstrated profound change from impulsive patterns that had characterized previous career choices. After several days of analysis consultation with both Richard and Jason Palmer, an honest assessment of alternatives, Thomas developed conditional response to Jessica's offer. He would accept position with specific parameters established in writing, professional responsibilities, clearly defined, separate from personal history. Performance evaluation based on objective metrics rather than subjective assessment. Reporting structure preventing direct oversight by immediate family members. Contractual protection against arbitrary dismissal, and explicit acknowledgement that employment arrangement remained separate from custody considerations. Jessica's family accepted these conditions with minimal modification, recognizing Thomas's genuine value to their acquisition, despite complicated personal circumstances. The resulting arrangement provided structural foundation for Thomas's professional rehabilitation while maintaining appropriate boundaries between employment opportunity and family dynamics. By early November, Thomas had secured modest apartment near his new workplace, simple one-bedroom with second small space convertible to children's room during visitations. The location offered walking distance to Neighborhood Park Public Library with excellent children's program and subway access to cultural institutions throughout Manhattan. Nothing approaching Hampton's luxury but providing appropriate environment for expanded parenting time. The court recognized these improved circumstances during scheduled custody review, granting Thomas overnight visitations on alternating weekends, plus Wednesday evening dinner visits. The graduated arrangement would expand further, pending continued stability and appropriate adjustment by all parties. Jessica maintained primary custody, but with explicit judicial expectation for cooperative co-parenting rather than competitive positioning. Margaret helped Thomas prepare his new apartment for children's first overnight visit, selecting appropriate bedding, stocking kitchen with favorite snacks, arranging art supplies and books with thoughtful consideration. The space would never match Jessica's family mansion in material luxury, but offered something equally valuable: their father's focused attention and environment designed specifically for their comfort and development. Watching Thomas prepare welcome signs for his children's arrival. Olivia's featuring watercolor flowers, Ethan's decorated with carefully drawn musical instruments, Margaret recognized profound transformation occurring through painful circumstances. The external trappings of success had been stripped away, revealing capacity for genuine connection previously obscured by performance and acquisition. Thomas glanced up from his preparations, catching Margaret's thoughtful observation. "I keep thinking about what I would have missed if things hadn't collapsed, if I'd somehow managed to save the company and the Hamptons house and everything else." He secured Ethan's sign with careful attention to placement at 7-year-old eye level. "I would have continued seeing my children through Jessica's lens as achievements to be measured rather than people to be known. I would have missed who they actually are beneath the performances." Margaret nodded, recognizing truth in his assessment without needing to verbalize agreement. The collapse that had initially appeared as catastrophic ending had instead cleared space for genuine beginning, painful but potentially more meaningful than continuation of previous patterns. The transformation extended beyond Thomas's relationship with his children. His professional approach showed similar evolution: more collaborative than controlling, more attentive to sustainable practices than impressive short-term results. Colleagues at the property management firm noted his unexpected willingness to consider alternative perspectives and prioritize long-term stability over dramatic gains. 1 year after Thomas's 40th birthday disaster, Margaret hosted small celebration at her Connecticut home. Not elaborate party with social positioning and expensive displays, but gathering of people who genuinely mattered in their reconstructed lives. Richard and Catherine represented supportive friendship that had sustained Margaret through difficult transitions. Jason Palmer attended as both Thomas's current colleague and emblem of professional rehabilitation. Olivia and Ethan participated with growing comfort in their expanded family configuration. Thomas stood on Margaret's porch as November twilight settled over the Connecticut shoreline. The same view he had initially dismissed as provincial now represented perspective impossible from Manhattan penthouses or Hamptons mansions. His children played an impromptu duet inside Olivia at Margaret's modest piano, Ethan providing rhythm on handcrafted djembe drum purchased during museum visit. The music lacked technical perfection, but contained authentic joy previously absent from their more polished performances. Margaret joined her son on the porch, handing him steaming mug of cider as conversation and music flowed inside. The year's journey from devastation to reconstruction hung between them, acknowledged without requiring explicit articulation. Thomas sipped his cider thoughtfully, watching shadows lengthen across Margaret's autumn garden. "I never properly thanked you." Thomas's voice carried quiet sincerity rather than obligation. "Not just for the practical help, though that was substantial, but for refusing to save me from necessary consequences, for offering support with conditions that forced actual change instead of temporary relief." Margaret smiled slightly, recognizing genuine understanding rather than performative gratitude. True connection happens when we see each other as we actually are, strengths, weaknesses, and all the complicated humanity between those extremes. That seeing requires courage from both sides, the willingness to be known completely. Thomas nodded, absorbing wisdom that would have seemed theoretical before experiencing its practical application through painful personal experience. Inside, Olivia launched into simple composition. She had created herself melancholy, beginning transitioning gradually into hopeful resolution. The music perfectly captured their family journey without conscious intention. "Always know where your seat is." Margaret gestured toward the gathering inside, small but genuine community, built on authentic connection rather than obligation or advantage. "And if they don't offer you one, make your own table." Thomas smiled at the simple wisdom that contained profound truth about human dignity and self-determination. The laughter from inside drew them back to the gathering, not to maintain appearances or fulfill social obligations, but because genuine connection had become the center around which their reconstructed lives revolved. The birthday celebration continued into evening, modest in external trappings, but rich in elements that constituted genuine fulfillment. Children shared creative projects without performance anxiety. Adults engaged in meaningful conversation without strategic positioning. Food was enjoyed for flavor rather than exclusivity. Every element represented values clarified through difficult transformation. As Margaret watched her son helping Olivia adjust piano technique with gentle encouragement rather than performance pressure, she recognized that the gift she had ultimately provided wasn't financial rescue, but something far more valuable: the opportunity to discover authentic identity beneath accumulated pretense. Through painful collapse and gradual reconstruction, Thomas had found path toward genuine connection impossible within previous patterns. The journey wasn't complete recovery, rarely follows neat narrative arcs with definitive endings. Thomas still faced professional challenges within complicated power dynamics. Co-parenting with Jessica required ongoing navigation of competing values and expectations. Financial security remained modest compared to previous excess. Yet beneath these practical considerations lay fundamental shift in perception and priority that transformed how Thomas engaged with each aspect of his reconstructed life. When Ethan asked innocently what his father had wished for while blowing out birthday candles, Thomas's response captured essence of his transformation. "I already received my wish, the chance to see what truly matters once everything else falls away. The opportunity to build something real from truth rather than impression." The simple statement, spoken without calculation or performance, reflected journey more valuable than material success could ever provide. Through painful collapse and gradual restoration, Thomas had discovered foundation for authentic life beyond appearances and acquisition. The legacy Margaret ultimately provided wasn't financial inheritance, but something far more precious: the opportunity to discover genuine connection within painful truth rather than comfortable illusion.